Welcome to this virtual presentation as part of our Corks on the Concourse event. My name is Marcy Frumker, and I'm the president of the Board of Trustees and a space advisor for the International Women's Air and Space Museum. Tonight, I'm going to talk about NASA returns to the moon with the Artemis program. And this first image shows the Orion capsule and the moon. It was taken from a camera on one of Orion's solar panels during the Artemis 1 uncrewed mission that launched in November 2022. And NASA aims to land humans on the moon no earlier than 2025 or 2026 if the current schedules hold. Back in the 1960s, when I was a kid, NASA fulfilled President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man safely on the moon and returning him to Earth. Here are some facts about the Apollo program. The Apollo program was from 1968 to 1972. There were 11 manned missions. There were a total of 6 lunar landings. 12 American men walked on the lunar surface. 3 lunar rovers traversed the lunar terrain, and the United States spent $25.8 billion on the Apollo program, which in 2020 dollars, that would be $257 billion. One of the unsung heroes of the Apollo program was Katherine Johnson. She is one of the featured women in our museum's Quest for the Stars exhibit, Hidden Figures, book and movie. She started in the all-black computing division at NASA's predecessor, NACA, or the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and was quickly advanced to the Flight Research Division at Langley Research Center because of her talent in math. She was the co-author of more than 25 technical reports like the one in the slide over her 33-year career. When asked about her greatest contribution to space exploration, Johnson, who died at age 101 in 2020, said that her calculations that helped sync Project Apollo's lunar module with the Lunar Orbiting Command and Service Module were the top ones. Another woman whose efforts were critical to the success of Apollo was Margaret Hamilton. As the lunar module Eagle, with Ohio's Neil Armstrong at the controls, approached the lunar surface, its computers began flashing warning messages. NASA's Mission Control in Houston had high confidence in the software developed by computer scientist Margaret Hamilton and her team, and told the crew to continue with the first moon landing with, as it turned out, only 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Hamilton later said that the software was not only informing everyone that there was a hardware-related problem, but that the software was able to compensate for it. Note that computer technology was really in its infancy then. The astronauts had access to only 72 kilobytes of computer memory. A 64 gigabyte cell phone today has almost 1 million times more storage space. Hamilton, who worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, popularized the term software engineering. In that era, programmers used paper punch cards to feed information into room-sized computers. And the image on the left shows the stack of Apollo flight guidance computer software papers that were actually taller than Hamilton. Hamilton loved math at an early age and became an expert in software writing and engineering after college. She was one of the first programmers hired for the Apollo project at MIT. And on the right, you can see an Apollo Block 2 computer, what it looks like. On the day that Apollo 11 launched to the moon, July 16, 1969, only one woman was working as a launch controller at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That was Joanne Morgan, who worked on her first rocket launch at age 17, just 5 days after graduating high school as an engineer's aide. After graduating college with a degree in math, she worked as an entry-level aerospace technologist at the Launch Operations Center at Kennedy Space Center. Her shift for the Apollo 11 launch was to check communication, guidance, and control systems starting 3 hours before the launch. After Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, Morgan noted, "It was 500 men and her in launch control at Kennedy Space Center that historic launch day." Morgan worked at NASA for 45 years before retiring in 2003. She would continue throughout her career to be the first female division chief, the first female senior executive at Kennedy Space Center, the first female associate director, and the first female director of safety and mission assurance at Kennedy Space Center. This slide shows the changing of the guard at NASA. On the left are Joanne Morgan and Charlie Blackwell Thompson, and they're in the Kennedy Space Center Launch Control Center for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 launch in 2019. On the right in the slide, Blackwell Thompson is shown at the launch director's console, where she performed her job as the Artemis 1 launch director in 2022. And throughout NASA's storied programs, that's for Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, and the Space Shuttle, Charlie Blackwell Thompson is the first female launch director ever. For the Artemis Return to the Moon program, NASA uses the Orion capsule. Shown here is the delivery of the Orion and its service module that was flown to Mansfield, Ohio, which I happened to see in person, with its precious cargo in November 2019. NASA's Super Guppy plane is a large, wide-bodied cargo aircraft used for hauling outsized cargo components. The Super Guppy is the only airplane in the world to carry a Saturn V S-4B stage during the Apollo program. And now it has carried the Orion capsule for the Artemis program. Here's another photo I took when Orion was inside what's called the Space Environments Complex for testing at then NASA Glenn's Plumbrook Station in Sandusky, Ohio. And by the way, this vacuum chamber at Plumbrook, which is now called the Armstrong Test Facility, is about the size of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, which is 100 feet in diameter by 122 feet tall. So it's like really, really big when you're standing in there. The image on the left is the Orion Test Project Manager, Nicole Smith, who orchestrated the transportation to and from Glenn's Plumbrook Station in Sandusky and Mansfield, Ohio. In the slide on the right, it explains the two types of different testing done on Orion. First, there was thermal vacuum testing to ensure Orion's thermal control system performed correctly in the vacuum of space at extreme flight conditions. So that would be from minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And the second part of the testing was to test electromagnetic immunity, and that was to ensure that all of Orion's electronic components had an electromagnetic field that can affect other electronics nearby. This testing ensured that the spacecraft's electronics worked properly when operated at the same time. This image shows the Orion capsule during the Artemis 1 uncrewed mission. Again, no astronauts on this first test flight. But there were 3 test mannequins that were used to measure the radiation and the forces that astronauts would encounter on crewed flights to the moon. But now we have actual astronauts who've been named to comprise the Artemis 2 mission that's currently slated to launch late in 2024. From left to right, we have mission specialist Jeremy Hansen, and he will be the first Canadian to travel to the moon. Next is pilot Victor Glover, and he will be the first African American to travel to the moon. Next, Commander Reed Weissman, and last, but certainly not least, mission specialist Christina Cook, and she will be the first woman to travel to the moon. Now, the Artemis 2 astronauts have begun their training for their mission around the moon, and Artemis aims to bring in more nations, genders, and ethnicities as NASA works to build a permanent lunar base. This slide is the Artemis 2 map. It shows the pathway for the Artemis 2 flight. So initially, the crew will just do a day of testing in Earth orbit, and that'll make sure that everything is operating correctly. Then, just like during the Apollo moon missions, Orion will do a translunar injection, or TLI burn, that will last about 20 minutes. And that's number 9 on the picture. Necessary course correction burns will be done if needed. This mission will be a shakeout flight to test the Orion vehicle before the next mission, which will have astronauts on it who will land on the moon. The crew will test all the systems needed to support astronauts inside the Orion capsule. This slide shows the Orion capsule and its escape tower and solar panels. The escape tower would allow the Orion capsule to veer away from the Space Launch System or rocket in case of a problem during the initial ascent. The space shuttle did not have this important escape capability. This really clear image shows an incredible view of the Earth and one of Orion's solar panels. These panels were added after the capsule testing was done at NASA Glenn's Plumbrook Station. Each of the 4 wings are made of 3 panels that provide enough electricity to power 2 typical households, providing 120 volts for the computers, experiments, and other hardware. This image on the right shows an Artemis 1 patch. NASA has had a really long history of space patches for its different missions. And the image on the left shows Orion with the moon. NASA has announced that there are 13 different regions near the lunar South Pole where the first woman and the next man on the moon could land, with NASA's Artemis 3 mission now slated for 2025 or 2026. This mission will be the first mission to return humans to the lunar surface since Apollo 17 in 1972. All 6 of the Apollo moon landing sites were in the central part of the near-Earth side of the moon. All of the Artemis 3 sites are located within 6 degrees of the latitude of the moon's south pole, and all of them have intriguing geologic features. One of its objectives is to see if its permanently shadowed regions on the moon could have resources like ice. In addition, these areas were selected due to the amount of sunlight available. since that is a key source of power and protection to astronauts from extreme temperatures. NASA's Robotic Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, was key in mapping these potential landing sites. These images show the SpaceX Starship. The first fully stacked Starship was launched for the first time in April 2023 in South Texas. SpaceX hoped to send Starship's upper stage most of the way around the Earth with a splashdown near Hawaii. However, the vehicle's two stages failed to separate as planned, and SpaceX ordered its destruction over the Gulf of Mexico about 4 minutes after liftoff. This probably will delay the Artemis 3 moon landing mission. Artemis 3 was planned for 2025 to be the first landing on the moon since Apollo 17 in December 1972. NASA's Space Launch System and Orion capsule will be involved in Artemis 3. They will carry the 4 astronauts off the Earth. Then 2 of the astronauts will actually board Starship for the trip to the ice-rich lunar South Pole and back. This image shows the Orion capsule as it orbited the moon. Artemis 1 was the first uncrewed mission of the Artemis program. Artemis 2 is projected to launch in 2024 for the first crewed mission to orbit the moon. Artemis 3, which is slated to be the first actual lunar landing on the moon's south pole, is slated for 2025 or perhaps 2026. On this slide on the left is NASA's historic Mission Control Center in Houston, Texas, and it was restored to its original condition in 2019. On the right is NASA's Artemis Mission Control Center, where flight controllers managed Orion's uncrewed flight to the moon for Artemis 1 in 2022. Flight controllers commanded Orion during Artemis 1 to correct its path in order to ensure that the spacecraft flew to the moon at the correct time and place. This is very critical for the right lighting conditions when the crew will need specific lighting to eventually land on the moon for the Artemis 3 mission. This is the view that Orion's astronauts will eventually be able to see. It's a photo that was taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts in December 1968, when they were the first people to orbit the moon. It sparked the ecology movement for Earth back in the 1970s. Interestingly, Artemis 2 mission specialist Christina Cook said that she had a poster of this iconic view in her room when she was a kid growing up. This image, taken during the Artemis 1 mission, shows the Orion capsule orbiting the moon, but with the perspective of the Earth in the background. Technology has really sharpened this amazing view that the Artemis astronauts will be seeing for themselves. And one of Artemis 2's main goals is to test the life support systems on board Orion. Also, the crew will see if Orion feels like what NASA's simulators have calculated how it will fly. This slide shows on the left a prototype of a spacewalking or EVA suit by Axiom Space. And on the right is a suit proposed by Collins Aerospace. Both these companies were picked by NASA to create what they call the next generation of spacewalking or EVA suits for the Artemis astronauts, and also for use on spacewalks outside the International Space Station. In the center of the screen is astronaut Christina Koch, and she's modeling the new Orion launch and entry suit. Now, this suit, again, is just for when the capsule is launched on top of the Space Launch System rocket, and also when they come back to Earth. So it's for launch and entry. This is not a suit that can be used for spacewalking or EVA. This next slide is an image of the Orion capsule nearing what's called the gateway around the moon. And this is a drawing illustration. It's not an actual shot. The gateway is projected to be a small human-tended space station orbiting the moon that will provide support for the Artemis moon missions. It is designed for sustained human exploration in deep space, and it will include docking ports for a variety of visiting spacecraft, space for the crew to live and work, and will essentially be humanity's first space station in lunar orbit. And the slide on the right, that's Deputy Program Manager Holly Ridings, who in this slide is shown in NASA's Mission Control. Ridings became the first female chief of NASA's flight directors in 2018 when she was leading NASA's human spaceflight operations through the first commercial crew missions to the International Space Station. And during her tenure, Ridings spent thousands of hours supporting the assembly and operations of the International Space Station. She will be leading teams to build and launch the infrastructure in deep space for the Gateway. The Gateway is an international collaboration, and this slide shows some elements from different nations. Currently, 27 countries have signed what are called the Artemis Accords. Canada Arm 3 will be Canada's contribution to the Gateway. Canada developed the robotic arm that was used on the space shuttles, and then they developed a more sophisticated robotic arm, Canada Arm 2, for the International Space Station, which is still in operation. This new robotic arm for the Gateway will use software to perform tasks around the moon without human intervention. It will be used to maintain, inspect, and repair the Gateway, capture visiting vehicles, relocate modules, help astronauts during spacewalks, enable science on the Gateway and on the moon. It is designed to be operated by flight controllers in Canada and by astronauts during spacewalks. And as part of this agreement with Canada, Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen is going to be on the Artemis 2 mission. By the way, he's the only crew member on Artemis 2 without any prior spaceflight experience. This slide shows Launch Director Charlie Blackwell-Thompson viewing the Space Launch System stack on the left, rolling out to the Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. She joined NASA as a test director in the Launch and Landing Division in 2004. She served as one of 3 certified NASA test directors for launch of the space shuttles. She also served as assistant launch director for Space Shuttle STS-133 in 2011. Prior to her becoming NASA's first female launch director for Artemis 1, she served as the program's Test Management Branch Chief. In her role as launch director, she managed the development of all the launch countdown plans, launch and scrub turnaround procedures, and schedules. And the image on the right center there shows the power and intensity of the Space Launch System on launch for Artemis 1. This image shows the Artemis 1 mission that launched on the Space Launch System on November 16th, 2022, from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It exceeded NASA's expectations for its inaugural launch. There was some unexpected force of the rocket that damaged the launch pad, including an elevator. The Artemis 1 mission was a shakedown flight that resulted in a mission length of 25 days, 10 hours. However, the first crewed mission, Artemis 2, is set for about a 10-day length mission. On the left in the slide is the Apollo 11 command module being recovered in the Pacific Ocean in 1969. The Orion capsule from Artemis 1 is shown splashing down off the coast of California in December 22 in the image on the right. The test of Orion's heat shield was a top objective of the mission because it had never been tested at those velocities before. As Orion returns from the moon, it hits the atmosphere at more than 25,000 miles per hour. The temperatures on the side of the Orion capsule will peak at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while the heat shield does its job of protecting the astronauts on the inside of Orion capsule. This image on the left shows Orion landing off the coast of San Diego, California on December 11th, 2022. And the image on the right shows the preparations ongoing for the Space Launch System rocket for the first crewed mission, Artemis 2. And when Artemis 2 splashes down, it will also be in the Pacific off the coast of San Diego. NASA astronaut Christina Koch is shown on the right in front of the Artemis 1 rocket. And this was actually before she was assigned to the Artemis 2 flight. At the left, the workers at Kennedy Space Center completed the installation of her Artemis 2 heat shield on the Artemis 2 Orion capsule. Artemis 2 is set to launch on a NASA Space Launch System rocket in late 2024. Charlie Blackwell Thompson, NASA's Artemis launch director, leads the first simulation for the Artemis 2 mission inside the Launch Control Center at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida in late July 2023. So they're already practicing for the next launch for the Artemis mission number 2. A team of engineers with the Exploration Ground Systems are already rehearsing the steps necessary to launch the Space Launch System. This time, the vehicle will have 4 astronauts on top of the rocket who will test out and check all of Orion's systems needed for future crewed missions. In this slide, the Artemis 2 astronauts are shown spending some of their time, which they're going to be doing over the next 18 months, in classrooms, on airplanes, or in simulators with instructors teaching them the information that's needed for a successful mission. Their official training kicked off at the end of June 2023. Now, most of the training will be at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. In the image on the right, the crew members are practicing inside what's called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, or NBL. That's a giant pool at Johnson Space Center. Now, mostly the NBL, or Neutral Buoyancy Lab, is used for training spacewalking astronauts. In the photo on the right, the astronauts are using the pool to practice how they'll get out of the Orion capsule at sea after landing. In the image on the left, the astronauts are shown training in San Diego, California, where the astronauts met the U.S. Navy team that will assist with their recovery after Orion lands in the Pacific Ocean at the end of their mission. The crew is shown inside an Orion replica that military personnel will practice with. This visit allowed the astronauts to learn more about the recovery process and to learn how to work together with the military personnel. And later this month, Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen, two of the Artemis II astronauts, will travel to the Mistaston crater in Canada's Labrador region near the Atlantic Ocean, where they're going to study geology. These are the 9 NASA female astronauts that NASA picked for the Artemis program initially in 2022 out of a total of 18 astronauts for future Artemis flight assignments. And these women astronauts are on the top row from the left: Stephanie Wilson, Anne McLean, Christina Cook, Kayla Barron. And on the bottom left, right underneath that Orion capsule, is Jessica Watkins, Nicole Mann, Jessica Meir, Jasmine McBelly, and Kate Rubins on the bottom right. However, NASA later said that really any one of NASA's active astronauts would be eligible for an Artemis mission, not just those that were previously named to the Artemis team in 2020. And that includes those astronauts selected in December 2021. Excuse me. So we're at the last slide, and this is where I can let you know, again, I'm not doing this presentation live, but I encourage you to send your questions, if you have any, to me. You can send them via email to info@iwasm.org. And this also shows the museum's hours of operations, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Sunday through Saturday. And our research and office and gift shop are open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. Our website, www.iwasm.org. And please visit our events page for upcoming programs. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for attending tonight's program. We really appreciate your support of the museum. Thank you.